Hello everyone, Professor Wolf here. I'm making this video for students in my Introduction to Philosophy class at College of DuPage in fall 2025. We're in a unit on ethics. You all have an in-class assignment on ethics to complete. There are 4 questions on this assignment. In this video, I want to discuss the 4th question, the final question. Here it is. I'm going to read from my computer. What is the complexity argument against moral objectivism? How might the moral objectivist respond? Do you think that the complexity argument succeeds in defeating moral objectivism? Or do you think that the response of the moral objectivist is successful? Explain your reasoning. Okay, a few things. I'm going to review moral objectivism really quickly here. I discuss moral objectivism along with cultural relativism, relativism generally, nihilism, and non-cognitivism are 4 basic meta-ethical positions, that is, moral objectivism, relativism, nihilism, non-cognitivism. I discussed these at length in the video I made on question number 1 for the assignment. I'm not going to review all of that here because probably occupied something like 30, 40 minutes at least of that video. So just really quickly, let's review moral objectivism. Moral objectivism claims that the moral law is objective in something like we typically think the laws of nature to be. That is discovered, not created. We could be ignorant of them. We could be wrong about them. They exist whether we like it or not. We don't create them, we discover them. We don't create them with our thoughts, we don't create them with our words, we don't create them with our minds or our language. They're not created, they're discovered. And again, we could be ignorant of them, we could be wrong about them, and they hold all times, all places, right? Let's look at this through the lens of a sample sentence, an ordinary moral claim. Okay, the one we've been using is this: torturing and murdering children for pleasure is morally forbidden. Technically, the moral objectivist could say they disagree. They could say that that action is morally permitted or even morally required. They're not going to do that, okay? That'd be a really dark form of objectivism. You're not going to see any objectivists holding that view, and if you did, you're not going to agree with them, right? Pretty much every objectivist are going to say that claim is true. It is morally forbidden. They're going to want to go further and say evil, depraved, you name it. They're going to agree it's morally forbidden. They're going to agree it's morally forbidden. That we have a duty not to do it, an obligation not to do it, so forth and so on. They're going to agree. They're going to say that that is an objective fact. Whether we agree with it or not, it's true. Whether we like it or not, it's true. We don't create it, we discover it, okay? And where does it hold? Where is it true? Everywhere, all times, all places, right? Now, as I said in the other video, right, there's some question here of how much flexibility there is in objectivism, how much flexibility there is in objectivism, right? Here, I think objectivists are going to say there's really no flexibility, right? Nobody ever, anywhere, is ever permitted, allowed to torture or murder, let alone torture and murder children for pleasure. It's forbidden everywhere, all times, all peoples, all places. You weren't allowed to do it in ancient Greece. You weren't allowed to do it in ancient India. You weren't allowed to do it in ancient China. And here, I mean, I imagine in all those cultures, they actually agreed you're not supposed to do it. But the objectivist here isn't, when they're saying you weren't allowed to do it, they're not commenting on what the culture says you're allowed to do. And that's a separate question for them because they're not cultural relativists, right? They're talking about what the moral law demands, what the moral law dictates. They would say the moral law teaches, the moral law states, the moral law demands, the moral law dictates, whatever, right? The moral law imposes, whatever terminology you want to use there. that this is always wrong, all times, all peoples, all places. No one has ever, is ever, will ever be allowed, permitted to do this ever, right? It's just plain wrong. If people don't know that, well, they should, right? If people, don't like it, too bad, so sad. We're not allowed to do this. It's terrible, horrible, right? We're not allowed to do it. There's not going to be a lot of flexibility on that. And a lot of us might think, yeah, that seems right when it comes to a claim like that, when it comes to an action like that. So heinous, we might think, yeah, we're in agreement. That's never, ever, 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 ever okay. However, a lot of us think there are other contexts in which there should be more flexibility. So I'm going to use an example that, if my recollection serves correct, comes from a famous article by a philosopher named James Rachels. I think this is where I got the example. I haven't read that paper in a long time. I don't know if the example is real or not, but certainly there are cases like this in real life, cases that a lot of us would sympathize with a great deal. We can imagine there are two islands. We don't have to imagine they're close to one another, whatever. Two islands, or just let them be two societies. If you will, I'll continue to speak of them as islands. It could be two islands that each handle orphans in a different way. So an orphan is an individual, we'll say a child. I don't know if you use that term for adults. I guess you do, but we're really thinking here of children. They each handle orphans in different ways. So where a child loses both their parents, these societies handle those kind of cases in different ways. Island A, society A, culture A, what they do is they say, well, in a case where a child is orphaned, it should, and this would be taken to be a duty, an obligation, a moral requirement, right? That child should go live with the father's family, the paternal side of the family. That family then would be morally required to take in that child and love it and care for it, right? Island B, society B, culture B, would say instead, no, it's the maternal side of the family, the mother side of the family, that has the moral duty, the moral obligation that's morally required to take in a child, to love it, to care for it. And as long as there's enough families to go around, or some other mechanism, I don't know, the state, I don't know, right? Let's suppose we go to visit each island, and what we see is all families are large, they're robust, and they're all sensitive to this duty, they're responsive to this duty. So it always happens that when a child is orphaned, which of course would be, I would say, objectively sad, right? Objectively regrettable, objectively unfortunate, right? In every single case, Island A, the family's side takes in the child. Island B, the mother side takes it in, and the child is loved and cared for and grows up. When we observe these kinds of scenarios, how do we respond? Well, I think what we usually say is, again, terrible that the parents died, but there's nothing morally problematic about the father side taking in a child or the mother side taking in a child. We'd say they're both doing great. They're morally permissible. We might even say, morally, both options are permissible. Both options are permissible. Both are laudable. Both are praiseworthy. Okay, that's what we would say. And a lot of folks have thought this already provides pretty strong evidence for cultural relativism and against moral objectivism, right? We might look at some other types of examples. So a lot of us recognize that, if somebody steals a loaf of bread because they're starving to death, that's different than stealing a loaf of bread for fun, or stealing a Ferrari for fun, especially if we imagine a case where I don't know, the person stealing the bread has done absolutely everything they could, to find a job, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know, maybe somebody stole all their things, the person they steal the bread from, I don't know, bakes 100 loaves of bread a day and just sets them out to rot. You know what I mean? Like, we're going to be like, okay, yeah, I mean, a lot of us will probably say it's permitted to steal. We might not even want to call it stealing there. And, even if we did want to call it stealing, and even if we wanted to say it's wrong, we probably still want to say it's a little bit wrong. It's very different than stealing a Ferrari just for fun, something like that. Okay. So there seems to be a difference in our moral assessment of these different cases of removing bread that you didn't pay for or bake yourself from a location, these different cases of theft, right? And that might already seem to provide support for cultural relativism or individual relativism, some form of relativism against moral objectivism. Okay? I hear this quite a lot. Another example, if you just look at our society, we tend to agree that, well, I think we all pretty much agree you're not allowed to take somebody's life just for entertainment. But if somebody broke into your house and threatened you, yeah. Now, again, some people are hardcore pacifists. They would say you're not allowed to take somebody's life even in self-defense. I think most of the rest of us are going to be okay with that. We might want to put some conditions on it. Maybe we say you can't shoot him in the back, something like that. Maybe you have to have, credible reason to believe your life's really in danger. We might have some disagreements on how to articulate that. But I think most of us are going to agree that taking a life in self-defense is sometimes acceptable, morally permitted. But taking the life for pleasure is morally forbidden. And we might say, well, there's a kind of a variation here, a kind of a variance, a kind of situationalism, a kind of contextualism. And often it is thought that this defeats moral objectivism and provides pretty strong evidence for relativism. Again, let's not worry about the difference here between cultural and individual relativism. Let's just couch us all in terms of cultural relativism, which is what we'd be looking for the case of the islands, right? Okay. So here is, okay. I'm not actually, I could go back and clean that up, add a little thing onto what I just said, but I'm just going to leave it. Here's the thing. I don't actually think, and we're going to give a name to this type of argument. We're going to call it the complexity argument. And so what is the complexity argument? It's an argument against moral objectivism. And how does it go? The argument's going to go like this. There are certain actions, such as an orphan going to the father's side, or an orphan going to the mother's side, or stealing bread, or taking a life. There are certain actions, okay, that are truly morally required in one circumstance, but not another. Morally permitted in one circumstance, but not another. Morally forbidden in one circumstance, but not another. We might use the word situation here instead of circumstance. Morally required in one situation, but not another. Morally permitted in one situation, but not another. Morally forbidden in one situation, but not another. And we might think this just is relativism. Yeah, just, I guess to go back to the thing I said, wasn't going to fix up, right? Sometimes it might seem like it's a better fit with cultural relativism. Other times we might think it's a better fit with individual relativism. But whatever it is, it's going to favor relativism. Okay. Actually, really interestingly, if you were really convinced that some of these examples of situational or circumstantial variation could really only be handled by cultural relativism and others could only be handled by individual relativism, that would be a deep problem. That was kind of the issue I was avoiding before, but actually I'll just drop it here now, right? So, okay. And then the idea is that objectivism can't handle this kind of variation. So objectivism is wrong and some form of relativism is right. Okay. So let's take it again from the top. What's the complexity argument against moral objectivism? It goes as follows. Premise number one, there are certain actions. For example, an orphan being taken in by the father's side of the family, or an orphan being taken in by the mother's side of the family, or stealing bread, or taking a life. There are certain kinds of actions, certain examples of action, such that in some situations or circumstances, that action is morally required, but in others not. Or in some, it's morally permitted, but in others not. Or it's morally forbidden, but in others not. That is, in some circumstances, situations, it's morally required, permitted, forbidden, but in other circumstances, situations, it's not. And so that's premise number one. Premise number two is that if that is true, then some form of relativism is true and moral objectivism is false. Therefore, some form of relativism is true and moral objectivism is false. The logic of that argument is P, if P, then Q, therefore Q. Modus ponens, it's valid. But are the premises true? It's valid, meaning if the premises are true, conclusion's got to be true, but are the premises true? Is the argument sound? Well, I think even a lot of objectivists are going to want to agree with premise one. I think they're going to want to say that in the case of the two islands, yeah, both procedures are morally permitted, permissible. And not just that. They're laudable. They're praiseworthy. And in each culture, we might even say that practice is morally required. When it comes to the case of theft, I think plenty of moral objectivists would want to say, yep, it's permitted to steal the bread in the one case but not the other, in the one situation but not the other, one circumstance but not the other. And similarly with taking a life, I think most moral objectivists would say, yeah, it's permitted to take a life in a one case but not the other, one situation not the other, one circumstance not the other. They would agree with premise number one. They're not going to agree with premise number two. And the question then is, well, does that make sense? Should we accept premise number two? I don't think we should. And you would say, but wait a second. Objectivism just says morality is always the same, and relativism says it could vary from time to time, place to place, culture, maybe individual, right? Depending on whether it's cultural relativism, individual relativism, right? That's actually a bit too quick. Why? Well, I already touched on this a bit in the first video. The video on question number 1. From the in-class assignment. To say something is objective doesn't mean that it admits of no variation whatsoever, right? Again, it may be that, again, just use example lighting the match I used. I won't go through other examples. I gave others in the video for question number 1. If you didn't need that video to answer question number 1 because you got it from class, but you want to hear more examples for this question, you go watch that video, right? But just, quickly, an example I typically use is striking a match. So again, if I strike a match here in this room, as long as the match is dry, the strip is dry, I use the right force, the match is going to light. The match is going to light. But if an astronaut on a spacewalk attempts to strike a match in space, it won't light. Why? Everyone says, well, there's no oxygen in space. There's oxygen on Earth. Yeah, okay, great. There's a difference in the circumstances. In the Earth circumstance, oxygen. Space circumstance, no oxygen. That explains why the match lights on Earth but doesn't light in space. But then the question is it relative whether the match lights? Well, you could say, well, in a sense, yeah, it's relative to the different circumstances. Relative to oxygen lights, relative to no oxygen doesn't light. That is, as I said in the other video, that is a perfectly fine use of the word relative in ordinary English, everyday English, right? But is it relativism in the sense of cultural relativism, individual relativism? No. Why not? Because relativism says, in the sense of cultural relativism, moral relativism, when we're talking about moral relativism as a meta-ethical view that has these different variants, different variants of relativism. Okay, really bad philosophy joke. Cultural relativism, individual relativism. The idea is you get different, wherever you get different outcomes, that's because you have different sets of laws. So take cultural relativism. If in Italy, it's morally forbidden to murder for pleasure, but in France, it's morally permitted, that's because there's different moral laws. Italy gets its moral laws, France gets its moral laws, and those laws get created by the Italians and the French. They're created, not discovered. Why does the match light on Earth, oxygen, light in space, no oxygen? What's the law? There is no law in physics. You strike a match on Earth, it lights, strike a match in space, it doesn't. That's not how we normally think of laws in physics. We think there's a more, yet those are results you get that are consequences from a more general law together with what's actually or in your environment or not in your environment. And when really these are just consequences of laws of physics together with what's around us. Add a little more to this, right? You weigh less on the moon than you do on Earth. Is that because there's different physics on the moon? No, it's just not in the sense of different laws. It's the same laws of physics on the moon as there are on Earth. It's the same gravity throughout our whole solar system, throughout the universe. This is why it's called universal gravitation. What's making the planets go around the sun? Gravity. It's the same gravity. It's not like there's Mercury gravity and Venus gravity and Earth gravity and Mars gravity, Jupiter gravity, Saturn gravity. No, that's not how this works. It's not like each planet gets its own gravity. Earth doesn't get its own gravity. The moon gets its own gravity. There's like one force of gravity, if you want to call it that, throughout the solar system and really throughout the universe. That's how we think about it in physics. It's the same law. And it's discovered, not created. And we definitely don't create it with our minds. We discover it with our minds. We don't create it with our minds, right? Why do you weigh then differently on the moon than you do on Earth? It's because the moon is a lot less massive than the Earth. That's why. It's the same laws applied to different stuff, right? It's like if you drop a hammer and a feather at the moon at the same time, they'll hit the ground at the same time. They don't on Earth. It's not different laws of physics. It's because Earth is a different environment than the moon, right? It's actually tested by an astronaut. One of the early astronauts who went to the moon dropped a hammer and a feather at the same time on the moon, citing Galileo, who came up with this principle, and they hit the ground at the same time. It's super amazing. You can watch the video on YouTube, right? Super cool. So there's not two different rules that gravity plays by, Earth, moon, and then another for sun, Mercury, Venus, ... There's like one set of laws of gravity, but they can kind of enact themselves. That law of gravity can it can produce different effects in different contexts depending on what else is present in the context, right? And we think of whether the match lights or not is underwritten by the laws of physics. So there's not two different sets of laws of physics. We can talk about more than one laws of physics, but if we look at the laws in virtue of which the match strikes on Earth, those laws are also holding out in space. It's not that, again, we have special Earth physics, space physics, right? It's the same laws. The reason why we see different stuff is because different stuff is in the environment. And so this is, I think, a really good model of how you can have objective laws that kind of play out differently in different cases, circumstances, situations, whatever term you want to use, based on the details of what's going on, what else is going on in those cases, those circumstances, those situations. Now we can give zillions and zillions, oodles and oodles of cases of other examples of this in physics. And again, if physics can work like that, why couldn't objective morality? If objective laws of physics could work like that, why couldn't objective moral laws? There's no reason to think it would only work for one and not the other. And we can give lots of good reasons why we do think morally situation should, demonstrate some kind of sensitivity to context, right? And going back to the physics case, you might wonder, can you identify a universal, objective moral law that underwrites the varying situational outcomes? Yes. Go back to the islands, right? Maybe objective morality gives us some kind of principle like this. Objectively, every single culture has an objective moral responsibility, duty, obligation to care for its orphans in some way or another, but it can allow some variation in exactly how you do it. Well, why would objective morality let you do it in different ways? Well, why would it make you do it the same way? You know what I'm saying? Like, why wouldn't it let you do it in different ways? I mean, now you can start actually getting into like what is the nature of ethics and the function of ethics and all kinds of things. But here's maybe another way to think about it. There's no reason why a moral objectivist can't say, in fact, I think they would say that, well, let me be careful about that. If they agree that we have duties not just to refrain from harming people, but also duties to help, which I would agree with. I think probably most objectivists would. We might disagree on the extent, how much we're obligated to help. But I mean, in principle, a moral objectivist could say, no, you're never morally required to help anybody. You're just forbidden from harming them, at least for no good reason, right? And then I could tell you what counts as a good reason, no good reason. But I think a lot of moral objectivists would agree. We have at least some kind of requirement to help others, at least sometimes in at least some ways. Why would you think then that we're all required to help the exact same people, the exact same way, the exact same time? There's like one person on earth, Fred, that everybody's morally obligated to help. Well, if that dude doesn't live forever, lots of people aren't even going to be able to discharge their duty to Fred. You know what I'm saying? Like, no, why wouldn't you think that we all have some duty? We all have a duty to help people to some degree, but they're, like, how we exactly whom we help and how, maybe that's dependent on who happens to live around us or who we have the capacity to help or our talents, our skills, our abilities, even our preferences. Why shouldn't there be some variation in that? Especially if morality does have this kind of purpose to help us all flourish. I mean, then it would all work together. We could help other people. We should help people. And, also just think that ethics should aim to be effective, at least to some degree. Why wouldn't we be able to discharge our duty to others in ways that help us do it most effectively and also maybe develop our interests and talents and things like this or contribute to other goods? And there's all reasons why those goods could vary depending on the context. It's like you could have an objective duty to care for yourself. Some debate that. Some would even say, I got a duty to help other people, you got a duty to help other people, but maybe not necessarily ourselves. I think we could actually make a decent argument. We have an objective duty to help ourselves to some degree at least. Maybe that even includes flossing our teeth, maybe. But why would we think we have a duty to floss at 7 p.m. as opposed to 7:01? That's bonkers. Maybe it's just enough to just take good care of your teeth, your body. That's enough. Then you've done your duty. And there's different ways you could do a good enough job. There's no reason to think ethics can't have this kind of sensitivity and every reason to think it could, right? Go back to the theft case. Of course, circumstance could matter. Why you're stealing can matter. And the same thing with murder for pleasure versus self-defense. We talked about this in class with intention. Of course, the reason can matter. The motive can matter. It could be for all kinds of reasons. Again, if you go back to my candy case where I distribute candy on Halloween and unbeknownst to me, a sinister worker at Hershey's poisoned just one piece of candy. Never done it before. There's no rash of this. There's no outbreak of this. I've got no reason to suspect I might be offering a poisoned piece of candy. But I get the bag with the poison piece. I put the poison piece out. A kid takes it. They get sick. Again, let's assume they don't die. They just get sick. We're not going to hold me morally accountable. We do hold that person. Why? Because not only did I not have any idea that it was poisoned, I had no indication it might be poisoned, right? There was no evidence to suggest. It'd be different if it turned out lots of, candy was being poisoned that year and I knew about that. That's a different story, but we're not talking about that. We're talking no evidence whatsoever, no indication whatsoever. And if someone wants to say, well, you never know, so you shouldn't do it. Well, in that case, we should never get on airplanes. We should never do anything because you never know. I mean, come on. As I said, you can never give somebody a drink of water because you never know your water could be poisoned. I mean, that's bonkers, Again, you want to go that far, you should never get out of bed because if you do, you might accidentally hurt somebody. But if you stay in bed, you might accidentally hurt somebody. So, I mean, it's nuts. Like, we can't do anything with that. And we can even go further and start talking about, so I had no intention to harm. I only had intention to help, and that was all reasonable based on, evidence available to me, but that other person, they had an intention to harm and there was no good reason to do it. And people matter, so, it goes on and on and on. Again, with the Lamborghini, the person who steals it for fun, fun's not a good enough reason. It's not their property. We can defend property in various ways. And you get in debates about various aspects of that, but there it is, and it's a Lamborghini, it's frivolous, they didn't need it at all. Where the bread, they needed it to survive, and the person's life counts a lot more in the bread. We can give all kinds of good reasons for this. And just to go, so yeah, to wrap up, I think premise number 2 is wrong. The moral objectivist can make sense of all kinds of situational variation, circumstantial variation. And I would even go further and say only the objectivists can really do this. They can ground it all in flexible but objective moral principles. They could say in all cultures it's permissible for somebody who's starving to steal a loaf of bread to save their own life, because a human life counts more than bread. At least maybe they shouldn't be stealing it from somebody else who needs it to stay alive. Okay. It's always wrong to steal a luxury item just for fun. That would apply. The objectivist can make sense that holding all times, all places, all cultures. The relativist, it's all hostage to the polls. If the majority of people in a certain culture think that stealing bread when you're starving to death, even from somebody who bakes 100 loaves of bread a day just to watch them rot, that culture could say that doing that is worse than murder and deserves that you be tortured and executed in the most horrendous way. And then that would be the moral requirement. That's not what any of us believe. It's really objectivism that can capture the situationalism we want out of ethics. Cultural relativism, it can if the polls go a certain way, but it really, that's it. If the polls go the other way, it can't. It has no principle actually to safeguard the kind of situationalism we want. It's actually instead objectivism, which is kind of interesting because a lot of people, when they hear these kinds of considerations, they think, well, obviously, this kind of argument, the complexity argument, defeats objectivism and vindicates relativism. But actually, I think you could, not only is that not right, arguably the opposite is true. And again, the point here is not that people are silly or inattentive or whatever. These things are kind of tricky. There's one other thing I want to go on to say before I close and wrap this up really quickly. I think here you see exactly 2 good reasons why we should do philosophy. We see it's not too hard for us. How do we see that? Because actually all kinds of people have great insights into all sorts of philosophical things all the time. But without engaging with the tradition, without engaging with the discipline, we don't get it perfectly. And actually, we can make some decent mistakes. Doing philosophy then can really help us a lot because, again, as I said in the other video, if this kind of argument leads us, we get kind of tricked by it and we mistake our insight. We kind of see there's a sort of situationalism, but we think it has to be handled by some kind of relativism. So we go for relativism. Then that leads us to a lot of places we don't like. And then if we don't understand properly objectivism and we think, well, objectivism needs to capture this but can't, then we don't think we could go for objectivism either. And then maybe we start wondering whether we got to be nihilists or something like that. And then, well, that leads to problems. And then we get this paralysis. I think philosophy can be amazing in so many circumstances that it could say, you're halfway there, here's the other half. Things fall into place. And it's like, wow, that's awesome. And does any of this sound like it's just opinion? I think it sounds pretty darn logical, right? I think philosophy actually is I think it's pretty awesome. And I hope you see that. And I also hope you see that you all, absolutely every single one of you, I've seen your work, I've heard you in groups, you all already are doing some pretty good philosophy. There's so much more room to grow. You all have so much potential and talent. I think this could really do a lot for you in your other classes and your jobs, but also just living your life, being out in the world, developing yourself, being a citizen, all of that kind of stuff. So keep going with the semester and maybe take some more classes in the future. All right, that's kind of a shameless plug, but I'll see you in the next video. Peace.